Picture this. You're a Roman senator in 39 AD, and you've just been summoned to the imperial palace for what you assume is a routine state dinner. But as you enter the dining hall, your blood turns to ice. The Emperor Caligula is there, dressed in the silken robes of Venus, his face painted like a goddess, and he's gesturing for you to take your seat. But that's not what makes your hands tremble as you reach for your wine cup. It's the fact that your wife is already there, sitting far too close to the Emperor, her eyes filled with a terror that tells you everything you need to know about what's already happened, and the night has only just begun. Before we dive into these disturbing accounts of Rome's most depraved emperor, if you're fascinated by the dark psychology of power and how absolute authority corrupts absolutely, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that reveals what really happened behind palace walls. And please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible to think we're exploring these ancient scandals together from every corner of the modern world, united by our curiosity about history's darkest chapters. What you're about to hear aren't just stories of imperial excess. These are meticulously documented accounts of how one man's untreated mental illness, combined with unlimited power, created a reign of terror that made even hardened Roman generals weep with fear. The name Caligula has become synonymous with depravity, but the reality of what he did was far worse than most people realize. Because Caligula didn't just indulge in perversion, he turned the entire Roman Empire into his personal theatre of cruelty, where every citizen became an unwilling actor in his twisted productions. Let's start with the man who would become Rome's nightmare, Gaius Julius Caesar. Augustus Germanicus, nicknamed Caligula, meaning little boots from his childhood days in military camps, wasn't born a monster. In fact, his early life was marked by devastating trauma that modern psychologists would recognize as the perfect recipe for severe personality disorders. By the time he was 7, he'd witnessed the systematic destruction of his family by the paranoid Emperor Tiberius. His father Germanicus, the golden boy of Rome, died under suspicious circumstances when Caligula was just 7. His mother Agrippina was arrested and exiled, eventually starving herself to death rather than endure further humiliation. His older brothers were imprisoned and killed, one forced to eat the stuffing from his own mattress before dying of starvation. Young Caligula survived only by becoming a master of deception, living with Tiberius on Capri and pretending to enjoy the old emperor's own perverted games while seething with hatred inside. The island of Capri, during this period, was essentially a prison of perversion. Tiberius had turned the beautiful island into his personal playground, where he could indulge fantasies that even Romans considered abhorrent. Caligula spent his teenage years surrounded by scenes of degradation, forced to participate in or witness acts that would have broken most minds. He learned to smile while watching torture, to laugh at human suffering, to see people not as individuals, but as objects for entertainment. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, some say smothered by Caligula himself, the Roman people rejoiced. Here was young Caligula, son of the beloved Germanicus, survivor of Tiberius's purges, finally taking his rightful place as emperor. The first few months of his reign seemed to confirm everyone's hopes. He released political prisoners, reduced taxes, and hosted magnificent games for public entertainment. Romans thought they were witnessing the dawn of a new golden age. But something was fundamentally broken inside Caligula's mind. Maybe it was the childhood trauma, the years of pretending on Capri, or simply the intoxicating realization that he now held absolute power over millions. Whatever the cause, the transformation was swift and terrifying. Within 8 months, the generous young emperor had become something far more dangerous than Tiberius ever was. A sadistic genius who understood how to weaponize perversion as a tool of political control. The first signs appeared at state dinners. Caligula would invite Rome's most powerful families to feast at the palace, then systematically humiliate them in ways that destroyed their dignity while demonstrating his absolute power. He would force senators to run alongside his chariot for miles while wearing their heavy togas. He would make them grovel on all fours and eat scraps from his hand like dogs. But these were just warm-up acts for the main performance. What made Caligula particularly dangerous wasn't just his cruelty, it was his intelligence. He understood that physical torture was temporary, but psychological destruction lasted forever. He began developing elaborate scenarios designed to break people's minds rather than just their bodies. He would force aristocratic women to detail their sexual experiences in front of their husbands and fathers. He would make senators' sons serve as prostitutes at palace orgies, then send detailed accounts of their activities to their families. The palace itself became a labyrinth of perversion. Caligula had rooms decorated with explicit frescoes and mirrors arranged so that every corner reflected scenes of degradation. He established a brothel within the palace walls, staffing it with the wives and children of senators who had displeased him. The prices were set deliberately high, and he would force wealthy Romans to patronize it, creating a system where the elite were forced to pay for the privilege of their own humiliation. But perhaps most disturbing was Caligula's obsession with divine identity. He didn't just claim to be a god, he demanded worship in increasingly deranged ways. He would dress as different deities and demand appropriate offerings. When dressed as Venus, he would require male senators to court him as a lover. As Jupiter, he would claim the right to sleep with anyone's wife, declaring it a divine honor that couldn't be refused. He had a bridge built between his palace and the temple of Jupiter, so he could converse with the god as an equal. But Caligula's twisted genius truly revealed itself in his manipulation of Rome's most sacred institution, the family. He understood that Romans valued family honor above almost everything else, so he made it his personal mission to corrupt and destroy these bonds in the most creative ways possible. He would invite entire families to dinner, then force fathers to offer their daughters' virginity as dessert. When they inevitably refused, he would have the fathers held down and make them watch as he took what he wanted anyway, all while delivering philosophical lectures about the nature of power and divinity. The practice that perhaps best illustrates Caligula's sadistic creativity was his innovation of the reverse auction. He would gather Rome's wealthiest citizens in the palace and auction off their own wives and daughters back to them. The women would be brought out naked or in transparent silks, and Caligula would describe in graphic detail what he had done or planned to do with each one. The husbands and fathers had to bid against each other to purchase their own family members' safety, at least until the next auction. One documented case involved Senator Lucius Vitellius, whose wife was particularly beautiful. Caligula didn't just take her, he made it into an elaborate piece of theatre. He sent Vitellius a formal invitation to watch the sacred union between God and mortal, forcing the senator to sit in a place of honour while Caligula violated his wife on a platform designed to look like an altar. Throughout the act, Caligula provided commentary as if he were a priest explaining a religious ritual, describing how mortals should feel honoured to be chosen by the divine. The emperor's sexual appetites knew no boundaries of gender, age or relation. He publicly boasted about sleeping with all three of his sisters, particularly his favourite, Drusilla. But even this incestuous relationship was twisted into something darker. He would force Drusilla to attend state dinners dressed as his wife, making foreign ambassadors and Roman nobles acknowledge her as empress while everyone knew the truth. When she died, some say from the physical toll of his abuse, Caligula's grief took forms that horrified even jaded Romans. He declared Drusilla a goddess and made it a capital crime to mourn her as a mortal. Citizens had to celebrate her divinity, while Caligula openly wept and raged. He would appear at random homes in the middle of the night, demanding to know if the inhabitants were properly honouring the goddess Drusilla. Those who showed insufficient enthusiasm were dragged to the palace for lessons in proper worship that often ended in death or worse. The financial perversions were equally creative. Caligula discovered that combining sex with economics created particularly effective forms of control. He established a tax on marriage, but the rate varied based on how attractive he found the bride. Beautiful women faced ruinous taxes unless their husbands agreed to loan them to the emperor for specified periods. He also created a tax on prostitution, then forced noble women to register as prostitutes to humiliate their families, making them pay for their own degradation. His treatment of the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite military unit, reveals another dimension of his perversion. These hardened soldiers, responsible for protecting the emperor, became unwilling participants in his sexual games. He would dress guardsmen as women and force them to perform in theatrical productions where they were ravished by actors playing gods. Any sign of resistance or disgust was punished by forcing the soldier to continue the performance with their own family members as co-stars. One of the most psychologically devastating practices was what Caligula called divine inspection. He would summon married couples to the palace and examine them naked, comparing their bodies to statues of gods and goddesses. He would point out every flaw, every imperfection, explaining why they were unworthy of divine notice. Then he would demonstrate the proper way to worship the gods through forced sexual acts, making spouses perform with each other according to his specific instructions, while he provided running commentary on their technique and enthusiasm. The arena became another venue for sexualized violence. Caligula would force condemned prisoners to engage in sexual acts with animals before being killed, turning executions into pornographic spectacles. He particularly enjoyed forcing former lovers to fight each other to the death, promising freedom to the winner, but usually finding an excuse to execute them anyway. Noble women who had refused his advances would find themselves thrown to professional gladiators with instructions to use them before killing them. What made these spectacles particularly horrifying was Caligula's insistence that the audience show enthusiasm. Senators and their families had to cheer and applaud the degradation they witnessed. Those who looked away or showed disgust were noted by the emperor's spies and would often find themselves or their loved ones featured in the next performance. The entire Roman elite became trapped in a nightmare where they had to enthusiastically participate in their own moral destruction. The palace orgies grew increasingly elaborate and bizarre. Caligula would recreate mythological scenes with unwilling participants playing the roles of gods and mortals. A favourite was the story of Pasiphae and the bull, which he would stage using the wives of men who had displeased him. He imported exotic animals from across the empire specifically for these productions, creating a menagerie of horror that served his twisted imagination. The corruption of Rome's legal system became Caligula's next frontier of perversion. He realised that true power meant not just breaking laws, but rewriting reality itself. He began holding mock trials where husbands were prosecuted for denying the divine if they objected to their wives being taken. The punishment was always the same, being forced to watch as Caligula demonstrated the proper way to worship divinity through their spouse. But here's where his genius for cruelty truly shone. He would make the husbands thank him afterward, declaring them blessed to have witnessed divine instruction. Consider the case of Marcus Lepidus, once Caligula's closest friend and rumoured successor. When Lepidus showed signs of independence, Caligula didn't just execute him. He orchestrated an elaborate destruction of everyone Lepidus loved. He forced Lepidus's wife to become his concubine, but not in private. She had to service the emperor during Senate meetings while her husband's friends and colleagues watched. Then Caligula would pause state business to ask the senators their opinion on her performance, making them complicit in the humiliation. The perversion of hospitality became another specialty. In Roman culture, hospitality was sacred, but Caligula weaponized it. He would appear at wealthy citizens' homes unannounced with an entourage of followers, claiming divine right to their hospitality. Once inside, he would demand to inspect the household's women, from wives to daughters to slaves. He would line them up naked and critique their bodies as if examining livestock, then choose several for immediate use while forcing the men of the house to serve wine and refreshments to his entourage during the violations. But Caligula's most diabolical innovation was the creation of sexual competitions. He would organise events where Rome's elite were forced to compete in degrading acts for his amusement. Mothers and daughters would be made to compete for who could please more soldiers in an hour, with the loser facing worse punishments. Brothers would be forced to fight for the privilege of their sisters, avoiding the arena. These competitions were presented as religious festivals, with Caligula presiding as high priest of his own sick religion. The systematic destruction of marriage became almost an art form. Caligula would attend weddings uninvited, claiming divine right to bless the union. His blessing consisted of taking the bride before the marriage could be consummated, often in front of the wedding guests. He particularly enjoyed corrupting the traditional Roman wedding night rituals, forcing new husbands to prepare their own wives for him while reciting prayers to his divinity. Some marriages he would annul immediately after violating the bride. Others he would allow to continue just so he could return periodically to remind the couple of their place. His treatment of pregnant women revealed new depths of depravity. Caligula claimed that, as a god, he had the right to bless unborn children through their mothers. He would summon pregnant wives of senators and subject them to ritualistic violations while declaring he was ensuring divine favour for their offspring. If the women later miscarried, he would publicly blame the husband for insufficient faith in his divinity. If the children were born, he would claim partial parentage and demand they be raised with knowledge of their divine connection. The confusion of gender became another tool of humiliation. Caligula would force masculine Roman generals to dress and act as women at palace functions, complete with makeup and feminine mannerisms. But it went beyond simple cross-dressing. He would assign these transformed men as wives to their own subordinates, creating hierarchies of humiliation that destroyed traditional military command structures. A centurion might find his general now serving as his bride at Caligula's command, expected to maintain the fiction even in private or face death. Perhaps most psychologically damaging were Caligula's trading ceremonies. He would gather groups of elite families and force them to trade spouses and children for his entertainment. A senator might have to give his wife to his worst political enemy while receiving that man's daughter in return. These trades weren't permanent. Caligula would reverse or rearrange them at whim, ensuring no one could ever feel secure in their relationships. The emotional torture of never knowing who you might be forced to share a bed with, or who might be sharing your spouse's bed, drove many to madness. The emperor's banquets evolved into carefully orchestrated nightmares. He would serve food shaped like human genitals and force guests to eat while describing the sexual acts they represented. Wine would be served in cups modelled after the breasts of specific senators' wives, with the women present and forced to acknowledge the honour. The culmination of these dinners often involved live demonstrations where professional prostitutes would act out scenes, while Caligula provided commentary comparing their techniques to those of various noble women he had sampled. His obsession with documenting his conquests added another layer of horror. Caligula kept detailed records of every sexual encounter, rating performances and comparing family members to each other. He would read these accounts aloud at public gatherings, asking audiences to vote on who had pleased him most. Mothers would be forced to hear how their daughters compared to them, sisters ranked against each other, all while maintaining expressions of gratitude for the divine attention. The corruption extended to Rome's religious institutions. Caligula didn't just claim divinity, he inserted himself into every aspect of religious life. Vestal virgins, whose chastity was considered essential to Rome's spiritual protection, became his particular targets. He didn't just violate them, he created elaborate justifications, claiming that as a god, his touch didn't count as losing virginity. He would force them to continue their religious duties while pregnant with his children, creating theological crises that shook Rome's foundations. The manipulation of children represented Caligula's most unforgivable crimes. He established what he called a divine education program, where the children of nobles were brought to the palace supposedly to learn statecraft and culture. In reality, these children became pawns in elaborate games designed to torture their parents. He would have children perform innocent plays that gradually transformed into disturbing scenarios, forcing parents to watch their own children unknowingly act out their eventual corruption. The psychological torture of watching your child innocently rehearse their own future violation was a cruelty that broke even the strongest spirits. But Caligula's genius lay in making the parents complicit. He would offer choices that were no choices at all. Watch your daughter be given to the gladiators, or personally prepare her for the emperor's bed. Fathers had to choose between their sons serving in the palace brothel or being sent to certain death in the arena. These false choices created a soul-destroying guilt that lasted long after Caligula's reign ended. Survivors would spend decades tormented by the decisions they were forced to make, wondering if they could have chosen differently. The emperor's midnight visits became legendary for their terror. He would appear at senators' homes in the dead of night, dressed as various gods, demanding offerings appropriate to whichever deity he was impersonating that evening. As Neptune, he might demand the household's women bathe him while he described their bodies in terms of sea creatures. As Apollo, he would require musical performances that inevitably turned sexual. The unpredictability meant noble families lived in constant fear, never knowing when their door might open to reveal their divine tormentor. His treatment of foreign dignitaries shocked even those accustomed to Roman excess. Caligula would invite allied kings and princes to Rome, then systematically humiliate them and their retinues. He forced King Ptolemy of Mauritania to watch as his wives were passed around at a banquet, like party favours. He made Germanic chieftains' daughters serve naked at state dinners, explaining to ambassadors that this was how Rome honoured its allies. These calculated insults weren't just personal cruelties, they were destroying Rome's international relationships and creating enemies across the known world. The innovation of living statuary revealed new depths of creative depravity. Caligula would have people painted white and forced to hold poses for hours, creating gardens of human statues. But these weren't mere decorations, they were interactive art pieces. Guests at palace parties were encouraged to appreciate the statues in whatever way they desired, while the victims had to maintain their poses or face torture. Noble women found themselves reduced to ornamental objects, their humanity erased under layers of paint and the requirement of absolute stillness. Financial extortion through sexual means became systematized. Caligula created a complex pricing structure for avoiding various forms of humiliation. A senator could pay to keep his wife from the palace brothel, but the price would double each month. A father could buy his daughter's virginity back after Caligula had taken it, though she would still be considered divinely touched and unmarriageable. Those who couldn't pay found their family members' services auctioned to the highest bidder, with Caligula taking his cut of the profits. The arena transformations grew ever more elaborate. Caligula began staging massive reenactments of mythological rapes and transformations, using condemned prisoners and political enemies as unwilling actors. He would narrate these spectacles personally, explaining the divine significance of each violation to the watching crowd. What made these especially horrific was his insistence on historical accuracy, researching the exact details of mythological assaults and ensuring they were recreated precisely, no matter how impossible or lethal the acts might be. His sister Drusilla's death marked a turning point into even darker territory. Caligula's grief-driven madness manifested in forcing other women to serve as temporary replacements for his beloved sister. He would dress them in Drusilla's clothes, make them wear masks of her face, and demand they respond to her name. These surrogate Drusillas were required to know intimate details of the real woman's life, to recreate conversations and moments that existed only in Caligula's increasingly fractured memory. When they inevitably failed to match his impossible expectations, their punishments were spectacular in their cruelty. The corruption of medical knowledge added a pseudo-scientific element to the horror. Caligula employed physicians not to heal, but to explore the limits of human endurance. He would have them examine women to determine their capacity for various acts, creating medical records that read like torture manuals. These doctors were forced to develop drugs that would increase sensitivity to both pleasure and pain, chemicals that would prevent victims from losing consciousness during extended ordeals. The perversion of the healing arts into tools of torment represented a betrayal that went beyond individual cruelty to attack the very concept of human compassion. One of his most psychologically devastating innovations was the family reunification ceremonies. Caligula would separate families through various means: exile, imprisonment, or simply taking children as hostages. Then, after months or years, he would dramatically reunite them in public ceremonies. But the reunions came with a price. Family members would have to prove their love for each other through acts dictated by the emperor, performances that destroyed the very bonds they were supposedly celebrating. Watching parents and children, husbands and wives forced to violate their most sacred relationships for the entertainment of cheering crowds broke something fundamental in Roman society. The religious festivals became increasingly grotesque. Caligula would combine traditional Roman celebrations with his own sick innovations, creating hybrid ceremonies that blasphemed against every god in the pantheon. During the Saturnalia, traditionally a time of role reversal and freedom, he would force the reversals to extremes that destroyed lives. Slaves wouldn't just be served by their masters, they would be given absolute power over their owners' families for the duration of the festival, with Caligula encouraging and rewarding the most creative abuses of this temporary authority. The theatre of cruelty reached its zenith in Caligula's public humiliation ceremonies. He transformed the Roman Forum, the heart of civic life, into a stage for degradation. He would have platforms erected where senators' wives were forced to reenact their private moments with him, while their husbands sat in judgment seats, required to score the accuracy of the performances. Those who showed any emotion, whether anger, sadness, or disgust, were immediately noted for future punishment. The Forum, once where Cicero delivered his greatest orations, now echoed with sounds that would have made the great orator weep. But Caligula's true masterpiece of perversion was his corruption of Roman law itself. He didn't just break laws, he created new ones designed to trap citizens in impossible situations. He passed legislation making it illegal to refuse a god's advances, then used this law to criminalize any resistance to his desires. He established legal definitions of divine worship that explicitly included sexual submission. Most diabolically, he made it a capital crime to show sadness or distress after being blessed by divine attention, forcing his victims to display joy at their own violation or face execution. The documentation system he developed would have impressed modern totalitarian states. Every encounter was recorded in explicit detail by official scribes who had to maintain neutral expressions while documenting horrors. These records weren't just kept private. Caligula would have them read aloud at Senate meetings, forcing the assembled lawmakers to vote on which encounters deserved special recognition. Imagine sitting in the Senate, listening to a clinical description of your wife's degradation, then having to raise your hand to vote on whether it pleased the emperor sufficiently. His innovation of generational contracts revealed long-term thinking in his madness. Caligula would force families to sign documents promising not just their own submission, but that of their descendants. Daughters yet unborn were contractually promised to the emperor's bed. Sons not yet conceived were pledged to serve in whatever capacity Caligula desired. These contracts were filed in the official archives, creating a legal framework for abuse that could theoretically extend forever. The psychological weight of knowing you had signed away your future children's innocence drove many to desperate acts. The spectacle of the divine marriages became monthly events that all of Rome was forced to celebrate. Caligula would select a new bride from among the nobility, conduct an elaborate wedding ceremony, consummate it publicly, then divorce the woman by morning, but not before declaring any children from the union would be considered divine and removed from their mothers at birth. These rapid-fire marriages destroyed the institution itself, making a mockery of vows and commitment, while forcing Romans to witness the degradation of their most sacred ceremonies. His expeditions outside Rome spread the terror beyond the capital. When Caligula travelled, entire cities would desperately try to hide their most beautiful women and children. But the emperor's spies would report these attempts, and the punishments were severe. He would force entire towns to participate in mass ceremonies of submission, creating spectacles where hundreds were violated simultaneously, while he walked among them like a god surveying his domain. These provincial tours left psychological scars on entire populations, creating generational trauma that lasted long after Rome itself fell. The manipulation of the Praetorian Guard deserves special attention. These elite soldiers, sworn to protect the emperor, found themselves in an impossible position. Caligula would order them to participate in his perversions, then use their participation as blackmail. A guardsman who had been forced to violate a senator's wife would find himself forever bound to the emperor's will, knowing that exposure would mean death at the hands of the dishonoured husband. This web of complicity and mutual blackmail created a guard that was both absolutely loyal and utterly demoralized. His economic policies became inextricably linked with sexual exploitation. Caligula created new taxes that could only be paid through specific services. The beauty tax required attractive citizens to serve in the palace for set periods. The fertility tax demanded that couples produce children for state purposes. Children who would be raised in palace schools designed to create perfect servants for imperial desires. The modesty tax was levied on anyone who showed reluctance at public displays of affection toward the emperor or his representatives. The corruption of the games reached new heights of horror. Gladiatorial combat was transformed into sexualized violence, where defeated fighters weren't just killed, but violated first. Female gladiators were introduced not as warriors, but as victims, trained just enough to provide entertainment in their desperate attempts at self-defense. Wild beast shows featured scenarios that would have been censored even in Rome's most decadent periods, with human victims playing out mythological bestialisms that served no purpose but to satisfy Caligula's increasingly jaded appetites. But perhaps most revealing of Caligula's psychology was his treatment of those who tried to please him. Sycophants who offered their own families to curry favour found themselves treated worse than those who resisted. He would accept their offerings, then publicly mock them for their weakness, using their willingness to sacrifice loved ones as evidence of their moral corruption. This created a no-win scenario where resistance meant punishment, but compliance meant contempt, driving the entire Roman elite into a state of paralyzed anxiety. The religious ceremonies grew increasingly blasphemous. Caligula didn't just claim to be a god, he began improving on existing religious practices. Traditional fertility rituals were transformed into public orgies. Ceremonies honouring the Vestals became opportunities to demonstrate why virginity was an affront to divine desires. He even corrupted funeral rites, claiming the right to comfort widows in ways that turned mourning into fresh trauma. The systematic attack on every sacred aspect of Roman life left citizens feeling that nothing was safe. No tradition was sacred, no sanctuary existed from imperial desire. The final phase of Caligula's reign saw madness evolve into something beyond human comprehension. He no longer seemed satisfied with individual violations or even mass humiliations. He began speaking of transforming the entire Roman Empire into what he called a divine brothel, where every citizen would serve the emperor's pleasure in rotating shifts. He had architects draw up plans for rebuilding Rome itself, with every building designed to facilitate surveillance and access. Every home required to have rooms specifically for imperial visits. Every temple converted into venues for his twisted ceremonies. His delusions reached cosmic proportions. Caligula began claiming he had impregnated the moon goddess, and that their offspring would be monsters that would devour any Romans who showed insufficient devotion. He would stand on palace balconies during lunar eclipses, shouting at the moon and demanding it show signs of their divine union. When no cosmic response came, he would rage through the palace, selecting victims to punish for the moon's rejection. These lunar madnesses became so severe that Romans learned to prepare for violence whenever the night sky showed any unusual activity. The breaking point approached as Caligula's demands became physically impossible to fulfill. He ordered the construction of a floating bridge across the Bay of Naples, not for transportation, but so he could ride across it dressed as Neptune, while hundreds of naked swimmers beneath simulated sea nymphs worshipping their god. When several drowned in the cold waters, he declared their deaths sacrifices to his divinity. He began planning even grander projects, a tunnel through the Alps where travellers would have to crawl on their bellies while reciting his praises, a pyramid larger than those in Egypt, filled with the preserved bodies of everyone who had ever pleased him. His paranoia merged with his perversions in terrifying ways. Convinced that conspirators were everywhere, he began using sex as a tool of investigation. He would violate suspected conspirators while claiming his divine essence could extract truth through intimate contact. These interrogations became public spectacles where accused plotters were subjected to increasingly bizarre acts, while Caligula interpreted their responses as confessions. The fact that everyone eventually confessed to whatever he wanted to hear only confirmed his paranoid beliefs. The Senate, once the proudest institution in Rome, had been reduced to a collection of broken men who competed to debase themselves most thoroughly. Sessions devolved into contests of who could offer Caligula the most degrading praise or the most creative suggestions for new perversions. One senator famously offered to sacrifice his entire family line, past and future, to the emperor's pleasure. Instead of being rewarded, he was mocked for thinking his worthless bloodline deserved such divine attention, then forced to watch as his offer was accepted anyway. Foreign relations collapsed entirely as word of Rome's madness spread. Allied kingdoms began severing ties rather than send ambassadors who would inevitably be humiliated or worse. Trade delegations refused to enter Roman territory. The empire that had dominated through military might and political cunning was becoming isolated through the sheer revulsion of its neighbours. Caligula responded by declaring war on the ocean itself, ordering his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of victory against Neptune, whom he now considered a rival deity. The Praetorian Guard finally reached their limit when Caligula announced plans to move the capital to Alexandria, where he believed he would be properly worshipped as a living god. The prospect of leaving Rome to follow this madman into an even more decadent exile broke through their conditioned obedience. Secret meetings began. Careful conspiracies formed among men who knew discovery meant not just death, but the kind of prolonged torture that had become Caligula's signature. On January the 24th, 41 AD, the conspiracy struck. Caligula was attending games at the palace complex when Cassius Caria, a Praetorian tribune whom Caligula had repeatedly humiliated by mocking his supposedly effeminate voice, approached with several confederates. The first blade struck while Caligula was discussing plans for a new spectacle involving the forced marriage of senators to animals. As steel pierced his body, witnesses say his last words were not pleas for mercy but threats of divine vengeance and promises that his death would curse Rome forever. The assassination triggered a purge that revealed the depth of Rome's trauma. Not content with killing Caligula, the conspirators hunted down his wife and infant daughter, smashing the baby's head against a wall in a frenzy of violence that showed how deeply the emperor's cruelties had poisoned Roman souls. The Senate initially tried to restore the Republic, but they were too broken, too compromised by their participation in Caligula's games to assert moral authority. The Praetorian Guard, seeking stability and protection from vengeance, elevated Claudius to the purple, establishing a precedent of military king-making that would plague Rome for centuries. What followed Caligula's death was perhaps as telling as his life. The Senate ordered his statues destroyed, his inscriptions erased, his acts annulled, a damnatio memoriae intended to wipe him from history. But you cannot erase trauma through legislation. The victims of his reign carried their scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Families were left with impossible questions about complicity and survival. Children born of his forced unions grew up knowing their very existence was rooted in violence. The damage to Roman society proved lasting. The sacred bonds of marriage, family, and social hierarchy had been so thoroughly violated that they never fully recovered their sanctity. Future emperors, even relatively benign ones, found that Caligula had permanently expanded the boundaries of acceptable imperial behaviour. What had once been unthinkable became merely extreme. The Roman people had learned to survive absolute depravity, but in learning to survive, they had lost something essential about what it meant to be civilized. Modern historians still debate whether Caligula was insane, evil, or both. But perhaps that's the wrong question. What Caligula's reign truly demonstrates is how absolute power, combined with human creativity, can produce horrors beyond individual madness. He didn't just abuse power. He innovated new forms of abuse that revealed terrifying possibilities lurking within human nature. His legacy serves as an eternal warning that given sufficient power and insufficient restraint, human beings are capable of transforming civilization itself into an instrument of torture. The story of Caligula forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about authority, complicity, and survival. Every senator who participated in his games, every guard who followed his orders, every citizen who cheered at his spectacles made his reign possible. Evil, on such a scale, requires not just a monster, but a system that enables monstrosity. In the end, Caligula's greatest perversion might have been showing Rome, and history, just how thin the line between civilization and savagery really is, and how quickly that line can be crossed when power meets pathology. His 4-year reign left scars on the Roman psyche that lasted centuries, proof that some wounds to the collective soul never fully heal.